So welcome back, everybody. Today I have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Nadine Richings, and she's going to answer the 6 big questions related to reproduction that give us an overview of the process as a whole. Nadine, thank you for joining us, and it's great to have you.
Thanks, Mo. Great to be here with you. So I guess people are probably wondering who I am and why I'm here. So I was born a biologist. Some of my earliest memories are looking at the natural world, and I then later went on to get degrees in biology. And one of the areas of biology that really fascinated me was reproduction. So I did honours in marsupial embryology. I later went on to do a PhD at the University of Melbourne. So I realised when I was doing honours that I wanted to use assisted reproduction to save endangered species. And there were 2 things that I needed: a PhD, which I later went and got, and I needed to learn the big systems of assisted reproduction. And the species that those systems are best developed in are our own species, humans. So assisted reproduction are all things including egg collections, sperm collection, in vitro fertilisation, embryo transfer, embryo cryopreservation. All of those things fit into assisted reproduction. So I worked as a clinical embryologist for about 10 years, and then I used that knowledge and that training in my PhD to apply that to marsupials. So I was the first person in the world to create an Australian marsupial in vitro. Yay me. But when I finished my PhD, one of the things I realised was I got out very excited to continue the work, but there were no jobs in Australia. And it became very evident to me that Australia just doesn't care enough about the environment, about our incredible species that are very unique to Australia. So I found myself looking at all the scientists doing their work in the labs, doing their work out in the field, and looking over there at society and noticed the big chasm between the two. So I then realised that somebody's got to jump into that gap and basically connect science and society. So I've now found myself doing a lot of that. So I am a reproductive biologist, a scientist, but I also do a lot of policy work. I've broadened my work out to the way the entire planet works as a system, so planetary health and the things that impact the health of the planet. And I work as a senior lecturer at Monash University, where I teach 2 postgraduate degrees in reproductive biology, and I also do a lot of work connecting with policy, including previously I've actually run as a candidate at both federal and state level. I've worked as a political advisor to a Victorian MP. So quite a broad lot of work, and I'm very happy to be here today to talk about what I call the 6 W's of reproduction. So asking those big 6 questions from the point of view of a scientist. Why? Always start with why, and then who, when, what, where, and how.
Yeah. I think it was interesting you were mentioning about wanting to use the assisted reproductive technologies, in sort of like to conserve and native species. And what I found myself is when we look at certainly the human model and human clinical care, we've often taken from livestock species where we've done research there and then adapted that and built on that knowledge to assist the human side. And it seems now we can use the things that we learn in the human side to help with the conservation and protection of some of these wonderful species that unfortunately numbers are dwindling and at a rapid pace. So they're working hand in hand really nicely, and it would be great to get your insights on that. But if you don't mind telling us, going through the 6 W's and giving us a better understanding of what they are and how they work.
Sure. So I might share an image here that will just be really helpful to give an overview of what I'm covering today. So as a scientist, I love systems. So it's something, I'm very into systems, the way things connect, the way things interrelate to each other. So I'm the person who never stops asking why, and I'm always after far more information and context than most people care about. So a system like the 6 W's, which you can see up in the top right corner of my image here, I love asking these 6 questions, and they allow you to explore lots of things. So in terms of reproduction, We're going to start with why. So why is reproduction important? We're going to look at who is involved in reproduction, when does reproduction occur, what is needed for reproduction, where does reproduction and the events of reproduction occur, and how is reproduction controlled and coordinated. Now, it's worth knowing this is a really big picture view of reproduction, and we're going to try and cover it in an hour, so it really is just going to be a skim of these areas. But initially I'm going to be really focused on all species, so that includes not only all animals, but all plants, fungi, microorganisms. We all need to reproduce. I'll explain that in a moment. Then I will focus more in on animals and more specifically in on mammals. Remembering that humans are mammals. We are mammals, we are animals, and we are one of the species on the planet. So they're the 6 things that I'm going to be covering.
Fantastic. And as you said, I mean, we can, reproduction is so important for different species, and in actual fact, reproduction really means life. You know, if you look at even farming systems, for example, a farmer will say that they need reproduction because you need more, like say dairy cattle, for example, you need to reproduce in order to have milk. If you're growing crops and vegetables for humans to consume or animals to consume, you need to be able to reproduce. That the very important microbial species that we often ignore, that are present and that actually keep life going, that we just don't think about because we don't see or hear them unless there's a pandemic or the nastier bugs. But there's a lot of these microbial species that actually benefit and make our life so much more enriched, that reproduction is everywhere. So yeah, very much so. And remembering that right at the beginning, the microorganisms are our ancestors. Following evolution, which is what I'm certainly convinced by, they are our ancestors. So we all and not only are they our ancestors, but so much of our body relies on the microbiome. So whether it's the microorganisms on our skin, in our gut, in other parts of our body, we have evolved to work as an ecosystem. As an individual, we are an ecosystem working with all of these microorganisms to keep ourselves and them healthy. So it's a really fascinating thing to look into. Yeah.
So, we start with the why. So why is reproduction important? Reproduction, we've got to firstly start with the definition of reproduction. So reproduction is producing a new individual. I know that might sound simple, but it is producing a new individual, and it's important because that is how we continue to have species. That's the continuation of species, and quite simply, without reproduction, there is no life on Earth.
Yep.
It's a pretty fundamental question, which I didn't even mean that then, but I've actually mentioned the name of your podcast, but it is a pretty fundamental point that without reproduction, there is no life on Earth. So importantly, there's this really interesting idea. When you think about species, the survival of a species requires successful reproduction. Now, what do I mean by successful reproduction? You've got to produce a new individual that can itself grow into an adult to then also have its own offspring, right? So you're continuing the cycle of life, if you like. So the survival of a species requires reproduction, and in fact, if you look at extinction, we hear a lot about extinction, but interestingly, we don't hear enough about reproduction. So one of my great projects and initiatives is respecting reproduction. I really want us to talk far more about reproduction and the importance of reproduction, and for reasons I don't really understand, reproduction is one of those things that people don't want to mention. I think it's to do with humans' taboo about sex in general. It's like people say, oh, we know that happens, but let's not talk about it. It's an interesting thing, but if you think about what extinction is, extinction means that there is no successful reproduction and all individuals die or are killed. So whether that's in a local area, in a larger area, or on the whole planet. So the way that you halt extinction is, one, stop killing things, and 2, have successful reproduction. So the second point, so although survival of a species depends on successful reproduction, it's really important to then think about an individual. So an individual does not need to reproduce in order to survive, which is very different to what you think about for a species. And in fact, if you think about what happens to an individual when they are reproducing, it is incredibly energy intensive. It is effort intensive, and that effort really depends on what the species is and what its reproductive strategy is, but it's very effort intensive. It is stressful, and it is also decreases the safety of the individual. And happy to get into that later. But so I find that a real conundrum to think about. The impact, the species needs it, but it's really hard going for an individual to reproduce.
As wonderful as motherhood is, and I can't obviously speak to that because I am don't have the capacity of being a mother, but I think there would be many women across the world that would agree with you in what you said, that there's a beauty to it, but then there are those very real physiological effects that happen. On an individual basis, you kind of think, why do I want to put myself through that? Ignoring the species level, but as an individual, for sure, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that, that probably leads us to think about, so, okay, well, what are the benefits? What are the rewards and the reasons for reproducing? Well, obviously, we've already spoken about continuing the species, but more specific than that, there's also passing on the genes of the individual, right? Which I'm not saying as an individual we think about, but that's a really important thing. Thirdly, there's to be a parent. Now, is being a parent a reason? Maybe. We certainly have that drive to be a parent, to reproduce. And I think it most definitely changes your life, being a parent. It can give life satisfaction. It can give meaning. And that's not just to humans. Like, that is to other animals as well. And, well, other animals, other species, I don't know. But and there's also a fourth one. When you specifically look at animals, in terms of social animals, reproducing extends their family group. And there's a real benefit in social structure. We've all heard that comment about there's safety in numbers. So whether you're talking about, think about those wildebeest in Africa being hunted by lions or cheetahs or hyena, and the more that there are, they are very much protected by those numbers. Or whether it's a mob of kangaroos, or whether it's a collection, a flock, I guess they are a flock, penguins, that incredibly cold areas in Antarctica. And we know that in those big groups of penguins, they have this system where somebody's got to spend time on the outside, and then they have this rolling system where you eventually get to be on the inside. That's
amazing. That is amazing,
yeah. Where you're protected from the winds, and your head's still out in the environment, but you're protected from the winds, and you've got the warm bodies of the other penguins next to you. But that is an example of where the numbers that help. There's also defending resources. So whether you're defending food, water, territory, which are really important things to keep any species alive. You think about the only cats that hunt in a pack are, of course, lions, and they have their pride. You think about how that group that really helps, having more lions in a pack or wolves in a pack. Whether you're thinking about magpies, having a social structure in terms of a bird-like, and when I say magpies, I'm talking about Australian magpies, very different to Eurasian magpies, but Australian magpies are social birds that have a family structure. When we're talking about hunting, so I've already mentioned the hunting, child minding. We've heard that comment that it takes a village to raise a child. Well, that's not just for humans, that's for other primates, and of course humans are primates, but certainly we see it in other groups of, whether it's gorillas or, our closest relatives, the common chimpanzee, the bonobo, orangutans, gorillas, baboons, elephants are very big on a group looking after the young. We see it in wolves, lions. We also see it in magpies, kangaroos. We see that group structure looking after the young. So, and then there's an idea that it's called the social intelligence hypothesis, and there's an idea that it predicts that more complex sociality leads to advanced cognition. So, interesting idea, but you've got that incredible example in a couple of years ago. It was about four years ago, I think. I think it was in New South Wales, where a group of researchers wanted to study Australian magpies. They designed these little like GPS trackers, tiny little GPS trackers, and they created a sort of harness system. They befriended groups of magpies and managed to catch them and put these little backpacks on with these GPS trackers, and the researchers wanted to track the movements of these magpies, and they thought that the researchers thought they were being really clever. They were pretty sure that they had them set up so that they wouldn't affect the way that magpies moved, etc. And the only way you could get this off was with a really special little tool that fitted into a slot in the middle of the back. And then they released these magpies, woo, high-fiving everywhere, really happy with themselves, woo. I think it was within 24 hours, like it was really quick time, every magpie except the adult male, they'd been removed. The adult female went, nah, I don't know what these things are, but I don't like them, they shouldn't be there. And she just used her beak, put it into that little slot, got these things off everyone. And I think the adult male had it on for a week. So an abject failure, but they ended up still writing up a paper in that great way that scientists can, where they wrote a very different paper about the intelligence of these birds. So yeah, really, so these are just some of the important things. And in humans, there's also the idea that it does, as a reward or a reason, it does satisfy social norms and expectations. Like we do know there's that idea that reproducing is one of the greatest successes in life, and being childless can be very poorly considered in life. So yeah, it's...
Do you think that's... sorry to interrupt you, do you think that that's a uniquely human approach, where, look, in the natural world, if you don't reproduce, your genes stop with you, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's a quote-unquote failure of that individual to pass on, but maybe again as a whole the species survives. But from what I can see, and I genuinely feel sorry for people who have made a decision, I do not want to have a child for whatever reason, whether they want to pursue careers, whether they want to travel more, not be have that, dare I say, like responsibility or that feeling of being tied down, or legitimate reasons for making the decision that you've made. But we tend to look at people as though there's a failure. Why wouldn't you want to have kids? And I think deep down people might think, what's wrong with you? Do you think that we tend to do that as humans, that this is something uniquely about us that differs from animals? Or other animals?
The short answer is I don't know. I don't even know if anyone has ever studied it. I think that you'd only see it in animals that are social. So, obviously if you've got an animal like, say, like leopards that are generally singular, they move around you have males and females moving around on their own. Now, when they go into a reproductive season, then generally other things take over. There ends up being mating. But if you had a female or a male who, males wouldn't know. They basically mate with the female and then they go back to the fence. They wouldn't know whether they're fertile or not. Yeah. The females are either going to end up with offspring or not. Now, does anyone judge them? I have no idea. Do they judge themselves? I have no idea, and I don't know if anyone studied it. Within social groups, I think if you had a group of, say, baboons or chimpanzees, individuals would know if each individual has had kids, right? Well, it's only going to be the females that are judged, because basically you don't even know who the father is, right? Depending on which males have been with which females. But because in those groups there's so much support, and you have sisters looking after, you know, their sisters' kids, and you have, you know, so you have aunts and older sisters and brothers and things, you have them all in together. I think there's still a real helping hand anyway. So I don't know if the judgment exists the way it does in humans. I mean, certainly, some of the amazing examples that we really saw that really took my attention was, you know, Australia had, we had our first Prime Minister, female Prime Minister in 2010 to 2013, which was Julia Gillard. And she was very much judged because she'd made the decision not to have children. And there were these incredible words like, you know, she was labelled as barren, she was labelled as untrustworthy by males, by other male MPs. So it was really quite profound. And then over in Scotland, Scotland's First Minister during 2014 to 2023 was Nicola Sturgeon, and she had made similar decisions not to have children, and similar judgments were made of her. So I find it interesting that we have that judgment on females who are in leadership positions, but, you know, most of the male MPs, I wouldn't know whether they have kids or not most of the time. We don't judge the males in that sense.
When it comes to politicians, whether they're trustworthy or not, I think has got a lot to do with their actions outside of their ability to reproduce. And yeah, no, I definitely see it. I think there's a lot more of a targeting of women in that respect than men, which is really unfortunate.
Indeed. So I think that, like, this slide here just summarises the things we were just talking about. So these are the 5 big areas that I could think of that are reasons and rewards of reproduction. So they're the 5 I listed on the slide there. And the top 4, the continuing the species, passing on genes of the individual, to be a parent, and, you know, in social animals it gives you more support. They are very much based in biology. But numbers 3, 4 and 5 are also both based in society. So being a parent and giving you that life, you know, it's very much a social reward or reason as well. So, yeah, so I guess that leads us on to the who. Yeah, so...
who reproduces, yeah.
Yeah, so... It's interesting to remember that there are different ways to reproduce. So one of the ways that you can reproduce or produce a new individual, depending on what species you are, is asexual reproduction. So this is when one parent basically just produces new individuals. And so the daughter individuals are genetic copies of the parent. So pretty amazing, and we see this... So some of the methods that we see are, you know, budding and binary fission, in microorganisms. We might see parthenogenesis, which is, you know, like the activation of an egg. Also we see, if we look at some of the plants, we see things like vegetative propagation. And in fact, I can almost show you, because I've got one, I don't know if anyone can see that plant there, which is one of my spider plants. That is a plant that reproduces, you know, it basically puts out little spidling plants on the ends, and it produces through vegetative propagation. Another amazing animal, one of the flatworms called planarians. I remember doing my bachelor degree, my bachelor degree, and learning about planaria, which are flatworms. And you can basically, if this individual flatworm gets cut in half for some reason, they have a profound ability to regenerate. So each part will regenerate the missing part, and you'll end up with 2. And researchers have done various experiments saying how many individuals can you get, and they've cut it into numerous pieces, and, you know, it has a profound ability to regenerate. So that's pretty amazing. And so most of the species, so when we talk about the who reproduces via asexual reproduction, most microorganisms do. We also have many plants do, many fungi do, and some animals will do asexual reproduction. And then the other major mode of reproduction is sexual reproduction, which is usually abbreviated to sex. And this is where 2 individuals come together, 2 parents, and they produce one individual. So the benefit there is you end up with an individual that has that is genetically different to each of the parents, but it has that, you know, that combination. And so it's pretty amazing, because the evolution of sexual reproduction means that you have the development of the sexes. So that is where we came up with we end up having individuals who are female and male. And by this, this is an important point we get to speak about now, I do mean sexes, female and male. So sex is different to gender, and I'm not in any way saying gender is not important, but sex has a reproductive function, and you only have males and females, and gender is an identity, and that's where you may have males, females, gender fluid, non-binary, various other things. So it's possible, for example, to be, say, female sex but male gender. And we only see the gender question that we know of in humans. We don't actually know if any other species has a gender identity, because to my knowledge they've never told us. We don't know.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but it's pretty amazing with sexual reproduction. So as soon as you get as soon as a method evolves that requires two individuals coming together, you need a method to halve the genetics in the individuals. Because if you have two individuals coming together, if you take humans, for example, where there are 46 chromosomes in each of us, if two individuals just come together with cells that have 46 chromosomes, then you're going to end up with, 92? Sorry,
Mm-hmm.
92 chromosomes. So you need a method that creates a cell that has half the number of chromosomes. So we end up, so that method it's a cell division method called meiosis. It halves the number of chromosomes in a cell, creating cells, the sex cells or the gametes, that have half the number of chromosomes, so that then when the gametes, the sex cells of a male and female, come together, you end up with an individual with the right genetic complement. So it's pretty amazing. You need two methods for sexual reproduction. You need a method to halve the amount of DNA, and then you need a method that brings those two cells together, and that's fertilization.
And that happens very uniquely in different species.
Oh, it does. Amazing.
Yeah, if we look at, I guess with a lot of mammals, that there is that the transfer of semen, depositing of semen into the reproductive tract. But if you consider fish species or amphibians, frogs being a perfect example, where thousands and thousands of eggs are released, and then you sort of have this mass insemination process that occurs outside of the body. I find that really interesting. I want to get your view on that. Is there a benefit of doing it that way for a species as opposed to, say, how other animals have evolved, and you might carry let's say a litter in some instances, up to, say, if we use pigs as an example, a litter of up to 11 or something like that. But is there a benefit of actually having your offspring being grown and produced outside of your body?
Pros and cons everywhere. There's it swings and roundabouts. Where you get a benefit in one way, you get a loss in another. So asexual reproduction means that if you produce asexually, it means you don't have to look to run into another individual.
No date night needed. You just do it yourself.
Right, I think I will. But if you one of the disadvantages of asexual reproduction is that all of your kids have the same genetics as you, so they're not going to have any genetic. They're not going to have any better ability than you do. So that one of the benefits of sexual reproduction is that you get a new blend of traits and genes, and so you get that incredible variability and therefore an increased fitness. That's why
I married a Brazilian, because I'm a big football fan, and I mean, shout out to Iran, and I'm not saying that Iran doesn't produce good players, but we don't come close to the Brazilians, so that was my thinking behind it.
Yeah, for sure. And then your other question was, okay, when we get into animals that, or species, because there are plants, so species that reproduce with sexual reproduction include some of the unicellular organisms, so they're called protists, so things like, so there are some of the unicellular ones, but then you have most fungi, some plants, and most animals will reproduce via sexual reproduction. And so is there an advantage to this? Well, yes, there is, because you've got more control. You hold on to them for longer, so therefore you have greater control over whether or not they survive. When you take it through to, say, mammals, and also most birds, they are also caring for their young. They're basically pushing them through to adulthood before they go, okay, off you go, you're now an adult, off you go and have your life. So, but the downside to that is it takes phenomenal energy. So the more input the parents have, the more energy they have to put into that. So there's pros and cons, I think, to it. But interestingly, one of the other amazing things about sexual reproduction is not only did all those two methods, the halving of the genetics and then the fertilization to bring them together, but something else had to come about, and that is that sexual reproduction creates a sex drive, right? So that's the urge or desire to have sexual intercourse or sexual activity. And that we know that is present in all or most animals. I would think that it has to be present in plants or fungi, but I haven't been able to find anywhere where somebody can measure or have studied whether there is a sex drive in plants or fungi. But there are reasons and rewards for a sex drive. Firstly, it's reproduction. If you consider, to ensure that reproduction occurs, you've got to have a desire to mate, basically. Can you imagine a species that has a low sex drive or no sex drive is not going to last for very long if they don't have a reason to mate or an urge to mate. So the reward is obviously, in terms of animals, there's that immediate satisfaction, from the release of sexual activity. But the long term is that you've got sexual reproduction and all of the benefits that we've already spoken about for reproduction. But it's also, sex drive is not just, and therefore sexual reproduction is not just about reproduction. In social animals, it's also about the bonding and improving relationships. And we see that in humans, we see that in bonobos, so that's one of our closest relatives. So bonobos are one of the chimpanzee species. A lot of people have heard of bonobos, but many haven't. So if we showed you a photograph of a bonobo, you'd probably say, oh, that's a chimpanzee. So it's one of the chimpanzee species. But also dolphins are known to have sex for pleasure and not necessarily to reproduce. So it seems to enhance intimacy and improve bonding and relationships. But there's also the fact that sex drive is connected to aggression, and we see that in dolphins, lions, baboons, some of the other primates, that you'll often see things like infanticide. So when you have a male coming in and becoming the lead male, he will often kill the kids that are currently there. He kills them, mates with the female, so that basically his genetics are now being represented in the new generation. So it's a pretty phenomenal thing.
Yeah, I've seen several documentaries, especially with lions, how if a new male comes and overthrows the previous alpha, that there is no mercy shown on those cubs. It's very, very brutal, which just shows how the natural world is very brutal.
But it's worth, I mean, I agree, it is brutal, and you see it in baboons, you see it in lions, you see it in like a number of species, but you also see it in humans. And that's an important thing for us to recognise. And there's some information around humans and war. So, like, I don't want to go too far into that, but we know there are so many stories, right, not only in the present, but right back through human history, where males going into, when you have wars and one group of people going into another area, villages, etc., or territories of other humans, they will often kill the children, rape the women. You often see that sort of thing. But there's another interesting story around sex drive. So there are some species where sex drive can be fatal. And one of the most extraordinary stories is an Australian group of Australian animals So they're one of the carnivorous. So carnivorous marsupials are called dasyurids. The largest dasyurid or carnivorous marsupial is the Tasmanian devil. So most people are aware of the Tasmanian devil. We also have the quolls and phascogales, and then we go down to small ones that are about the size of a mouse. And so some of them are so there's dunnarts are one of the groups, and the other ones are the antechinus. And in the antechinus, they're about the, as I said, they're about the size of mice and rats. They're sexually mature at just under the age of 1 year, so around about 280 days. And the males, when they become sexually mature, they are consumed by a sex drive. Their sole purpose is to mate. They stop eating, they stop doing anything else, and the only thing they will do is mate. They have very long mating sessions that last, up to 12 hours. It's incredibly stressful. They have they're really high stress, hugely high levels of cortisol, which is the stress hormone. And ultimately, the males end up having a stress-induced immune collapse. And all of the males die at about the age of 1 year. It's called the male die-off. Quite a remark. You just sort of go, this cannot be true. But it is. And all of the males die. And what you're left with females who generally store sperm in the oviduct. And so fertilization actually happens after the males have died. And then all you're left with is females who are predominantly pregnant in the environment to then, use the resources. So that is a remarkable reproductive strategy. You look stunned.
Wow. Yeah, I am. That's, I've heard of insect species where when we talk about that fatal reproduction, where the female will, after the mating has happened, she'll turn around and snack on the male, but with the Tassie devils to not the Tassie devils, the antechinus. So the antechinus, yeah, to do a 12-hour, to drive yourself to the point of essentially death.
And the males will often, they hang on to the female so other males can't mate with the female. Like it's quite remarkable. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
How's that for a So and you're right. There's not just there are many spider species where the females are much larger than the males. So you can often see orb weavers, which are those ones that build those beautiful circular webs, and you see the spider in the middle. That'll be the female spider. And if you look out to the outer edges, you can often find a smaller spider that may not even look like the same species as her. That will often be a male of that species. And yeah, you're right. A lot of those, the male will mate with the female, and the females will often then eat the male after mating. Yep. So there's another example of, and I don't know if that's, it's a different way, but he must in some way know he's about to die.
That's so grim. That is so grim. Oh dear, isn't that funny? Like that drive to reproduce, knowing that you're going to die as well. Yeah. Look, are they conscious of that or not? I'm not sure, but assuming that you are, let's for argument's sake, let's go with this thought experiment. You know that you approach her. Yes, you've sort of got the prize. Yeah. But you're going to die. Wow.
They might think that prize is worth it. I don't know.
Well, it continues the species, right? And so you've got that deep evolutionary desire, built into that DNA. So,
and also it's the my genetics have been passed on, and now I want to support my genetics by giving my body. Here's the nutrients to support you to. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Well, I guess there's the ultimate sacrifice, isn't it? When you think about it.
Yep, that then brings us, I guess, to the third question, which is the when. So I think there's 3 timings I'd really like to focus on, and I'm not saying these are the only timings, but these are 3 big timings. So one is sexual maturity. So there's a time when you have young born, and they are young. In terms of animals, we call them juveniles. In terms of plants, you're often talking about seedlings and things like that. So you have, and then there is a time when you are an adult and you are reproductively active. So there's that time when you go through sexual maturity. There is it's important to consider that the reproductive system is not fully functional in juvenile animals. So it is the last system to gain full function, and I mean that's a really important thing to think about. And the timing of sexual maturity is really dependent on the lifespan of a species. So you have the juvenile, which is before they're sexually mature. Then they go through a timing or a phase that's called puberty, where you have the final stages of gaining reproductive function and the transition from juvenile to adult. So this is very specifically talking about animals here. And then when they're an adult, they are sexually mature, and they have sex drive and can reproduce, and they have reproductive cycles. So if we were to think of three mammals that are very different sizes, so mouse, dog, and elephant. So a mouse is sexually mature at 4 to 6 weeks of age, and their lifespan is 2 to 3 years.
Yeah.
If you look at a dog, their lifespan is 10, 12 plus years, depending on their size, and they are sexually mature between the ages of 6 and 12 months. And then when you look at elephants who live 50 plus years, their timings are far more similar to ours, where they're sexually mature between the ages of about 10 and 14.
Yeah, that's when you consider that time frame, like 2-year lifespan that you said with a mouse, and what that 4 weeks represents as a percentage. I mean that's incredible. That's absolutely incredible.
I find it remarkable to think, like, when you think about humans and elephants, we take 10, 12, 14 years before we're capable of reproduction. That is a phenomenal amount of time, yet some species can be ready in 4 to 6 weeks. Mice, rabbits, I think, are ready at about the same time. It's amazing that a system can be ready to go, and yet in other animals, it takes so much longer.
Do you find that is the case with animals that would be typically considered as, dare I say, prey species, as opposed to more dominant? Like for example, we are, even though we don't have necessarily the physical attributes to pick a fight with, say, a lion or and to win that, our teeth isn't exactly that sharp. It's just our brains that have led to us to develop equipment that would put us ahead. But do you find that those species that generally don't have that how can I say, that the fear of predation, that has allowed them to kind of delay the ability?
When you look at dogs and cats, and I'm not just, so dogs, if we think about domestic dogs and domestic cats, they're still ready at 6 months. 6 months to me sounds like a very small amount of time. But, sure, it's a lot longer than 4 to 6 weeks, 4 to 8 weeks, but it's still a really short time compared to something like 10 years. So elephants are still prey species. So when you look at something like kangaroos are not reproductively ready until, oh goodness, I know this, 1 to 3 years, and they will be. So that's quite a long time compared to 1 to 3 years before they are ready to have young. So it seems to be, I don't know, is my short answer, Mo. I haven't really looked at prey species versus hunters, and that would be worthwhile looking at. But certainly size. The bigger the animal, the longer they seem to take to reproduce. One of the things that you do see, and I haven't, is that in terms of, like, and it's a remarkable piece of biology, is that what you do see in prey versus hunter species is the ability of the if I'm thinking about mammals here, if you think about mammals, the ability of the animals to be up and moving. So we talk about altricial versus precocial species. So you think about how dependent a human baby is for years. And you think about...
even when they're teenagers, it would seem.
Yes, very So when you look at cats and so it takes, cats and dogs are able to move away from mum when they're about 8 weeks old. I think if you that's when we tend to take them away, but they would probably hang around for another 2 to 4 weeks. They would easily be with their parents for 10 weeks, 12 weeks, so you're looking at 3 months. You consider that when you look at something like a mouse, they're ready to reproduce at 4 weeks. Like, they're off and away. They are really alert, really aware. You think about something like, you think about those prey species, like whether it's horses, cows, sheep, but also think about the ones that they've sort of evolved from. So things like antelope and wild animals that are those hunted species, antelope and wildebeest, and they are born and they are standing up within a very short time, and they are running with mum on the day they are born. It's mind-blowing.
Yeah, I guess the survival, we were talking about survival of species, that really requires for them to do that. When you're born out in the Serengeti, I'm sure there's a lot of things that can pick you off, so you've got to hit the ground running, literally.
Yeah, the pressure, the survival pressure that would have pushed that system to become more able, basically. So the young that have the ability to be able to stand up and move more quickly are the ones that are going to survive more. And that's how, it really is amazing, though, when, they're born with their eyes open, they're born being able to stand up, even though they look unbelievably awkward. But humans, we can't stand until we're about 12 months old, and we're pretty ordinary at it. They're standing on the day they're born. Whew. Amazing.
It's pretty mind-blowing because then I guess mum would also have to flee as well. So you might think in humans, if a child is born, and whether it's in the middle of a war zone or if she's feeling threatened by someone, not that it's ideal, but she would be able to, would sort of stand and put up a fight. Whereas with these species, gazelles, deer, that sort of thing, like they have to flee. Because they're not going to put up much of a fight against a rampaging pack of lionesses.
Not only that, you've got a mother who's just given birth. You ask a mother to stand up and run 10 minutes after she's given birth.
I'm not brave enough to do that.
Amazing. But also, when you look at those animals, and it's not absolute, but many of those animals ended up, again, I come back to this idea of, that social structure. There's safety in numbers. So if you're a wildebeest or if you're an elephant and you're surrounded by the other elephants or wildebeest, you have some level of protection. If you're a fox, if you're a leopard, you're going to have your young in a little den. You're not a hunted, not to say that you don't have predators, but you are generally a
little bit out of sight, out of mind, potentially.
You're less hunted, and you have them, But other species that are also prey species have other methods of, being in dens, or, I'm talking so much about mammals here, but if we move over to looking at the birds, even with birds, like once they hatch, you again have those two different types of young, where they're altricial, meaning they're pretty weak and incapable and require a lot of attention and support, versus the ones that are termed precocial and able to stand up. And you think about just a chicken, right? Anyone who's watched chicken eggs hatch, like they come out of that egg and they're wet and everything, within very short time, all the feathers are fluffed up, that little chicken is standing up, eyes wide open, it's able to follow. It is very similar to, the antelope, the giraffe, the sheep, the lamb. So whereas you compare, again, it's very much, are you a prey species or are you a hunter? The hunters, so things like Australian magpies, all of the, hawks and falcons and eagles, their young are pretty useless when they're first born. Like they haven't got feathers, their eyes are closed, they've very much got to be looked after by mum and dad. So yeah, amazing. It's amazing what evolution and nature and all of these biological systems have, will support. That's quite remarkable. So in terms of our timing, like we've mentioned, We've mentioned the sexual maturity. One of the other incredible things is, of course, environmental cycles, so seasonality. So this is a really important thing. So, the timing that you reproduce, you really do need to reproduce when the parameters in the environment are at its best. And you'll see this seasonal breeding. It depends on where you are on the planet. If you're somewhere around the equator, you don't tend to get as much variability. I mean, you will have the really rainy seasons, versus less rain, but you tend to have a lot of water available, you have a lot of food available. But if you're in areas that are further from the equator, you will have those intense spring, the intense seasons. You have the intense winters and the intense summers and spring and that. So you will see things like, most animals show variation in things like egg production, sperm production, sexual behaviour, and fertilisation rates, embryo survival, etc. And this is, that's a really important timing to think about. And this is really being an additional impact to that is things like looking at the impact of climate change, because it's really heating up the planet, changing the seasons and the habitats, really impacting reproduction, and that leads into planetary health, which is certainly something we can talk about at some other time. So
yes, I'm really looking forward to getting
planetary health.
Into that with you, because the idea of species survival, whether it's humans, and I had a conversation with Professor John Aitken the other week, and we're looking at the drop in human fertility rates, mainly because of people choosing to have children at a later stage in life, or deciding not to have children. There are factors that play a role in that, but
there's so many contaminants in the environment.
Exactly. So if we do want this, our species, other species to survive, the environment is really important to look after, making sure that we don't have contaminants in waterways, which we're doing a pretty ordinary job of, to be honest. Like it is terrible.
So reproduction and planetary health is a big interest of mine, so very happy to talk about that.
And I've got actually a farmer who is a very close friend of mine, very close family friend, and he was recently interviewed in The Land. His name is Jeff Payne, Jeff and Linda Payne at Quarraballong. Lovely couple, lovely family, and he described himself, maybe offensive to some people who think this way, but he describes himself as a greenie. And people might think, oh, how is a farmer a greenie? But I think what's happening is that there are a lot of primary producers that do care about the environment, and yes, their farms are a key point in their survival to make ends meet, and these aren't bad people. They're not trying to destroy the environment, and in fact they're realizing that in order to stay productive we need to look after what we have, and so I think that the more that we also realize that it doesn't matter what it is that you want to do. If you want to have a factory that produces cars to sell to people because you want to profit, well, we need people to be alive to drive those cars. So what can we do to make sure that the earth is still in a condition that will...
Even more importantly, humans cannot survive without this planet. Like the planet is our home. It is the entire living system that supports us and every other species on it. We cannot survive. We are part of that system, rather than that system being there for us. And so the planet is our main health system. It provides food, water, oxygen in the air. And so if we don't look after this planet, we're dead. And so is every other species on it. And I think, so happy to talk about that in a later podcast. I get very passionate about that. So I guess the third timing that we need to talk about is reproductive cycles. So reproductive cycles are repeated biological events that drive reproduction. So female reproductive cycles influence male behaviour and sexual activity. So here I'm very much talking about animals. The female cycles, we can look at, for example, the ovary, which is the organ where eggs develop. I know you and I both did our PhDs on the ovary, so we could talk about the ovary till the end of time. But it is the organ where the female gametes, the female sex cells, develop. And so the ovary has ovarian cycles, and then you can look at in animals that have a uterus, so that's very much mammals, and that is also some species like some of the fish like sharks, etc., have a uterus. So there is a cyclicity of the uterus, so that's the uterine cycle. And then, of course, the reproductive system is driven by or controlled by hormones, so we have the hormone or endocrine cycle. And so those three cycles together, the ovarian cycle, the uterine cycle, and the hormone cycle, all together are the reproductive cycle. And you have this cycling. So we can pretty much think of it in kind of three major steps. We can think that there's the preparation of the systems for reproduction. So there's the development of follicles and eggs. There's the development of the sperm in the males. Then, depending on the animal, various parts of the system will also be prepared. So, for example, the uterus will be prepared in mammals. Then there's the release of the eggs or the release of the sperm. So that's ovulation in female animals to release the eggs. And then there's the reset of the cycle of the system for another cycle. Now, if we look at mammals, they of course have a whole other aspect to their reproduction where they are retaining the fertilized egg inside and developing it for an amount of time. So if a female animal is pregnant, then the system is directed to support that pregnancy. If that female animal is not pregnant, then the uterus is reset for another cycle. And it's really important to remember that 98%, so almost all mammals, resorb the lining of the uterus. So I think this is highly efficient. I'm way into recycling. I'm a greenie myself, recycling. You've got all this energy in that uterine lining, so why would you get rid of it? You repurpose, recycle it, and I think that's really efficient. And that type of cycle is called an estrous cycle, and most mammals have that cycle. In a very small proportion of mammals, so it seems to be about 2% of mammals, rather than recycling it, they shed it and it leaves the body in what's called menstruation. So most primates, including humans, have that type of cycle. Some of the microbats, so with the bats there's the big bats, which are the flying foxes, and then there's the little bats. And so some of the microbats have a menstrual cycle, also the elephant shrew, and the most recent one that was described as having a menstrual cycle is the spiny mouse. Oh, so, wow. Yeah, but important to understand that almost every mammal has a menstrual cycle. So, yeah, and these cycles, this is a fascinating question for me, Mo, because I teach this in a tutorial, and I think that this idea that there's menstrual cycles and estrous cycles, this idea, I think, is a human construct. And I think that humans study particular animals and they go, ooh, I study humans, they have a menstrual cycle, I study menstrual cycles. Ooh, I study cows, they have an estrous cycle, so this is their type of cycle. And I think that researchers have basically looked at these two cycles and tried to describe them as differently as possible. So they're generally described with their differences. And I'm not convinced that it's real. I think that it is far more useful to think about these cycles as being far more similar than different. And in fact, in one of my tutorials, I show my students a slide where people have set it up to make them look as different as possible. And it's very convincing. You go, wow, they're really different. And I say to my students, what I want you to do is make them look as similar as possible by labelling the key features. And it's amazing how when you do that, all of a sudden, it just looks like a reproductive cycle with some emphasis in different areas depending on the species.
Yeah, I was just going to say, look, with obviously with humans and some of those other species that you mentioned, that there's menstruation, there is that shedding, yeah. But the whole process is you're looking at when that uterus is going to be receptive to receive an embryo. And so in cattle, for example, we may not see menses as such, but if you look at their cycle, you will see, look, there's a window of receptivity, and this is what there's thickening of the lining, So, yeah, it's an interesting point that we tend to try but the picture as a whole is, when is this this female at a stage where she can support the growth of a and that's, of course, again, we're talking about mammals, but birds are also different too.
Absolutely.
So it's
I think in general, all of them are basically saying, in both the males and the females, are saying we need to prepare our gametes, our sex cells, to be mature and ready for fertilization. So they do that, and then, in females, it's an ovulation, and then if they're mammals, then they've also got, depending on the animal, they'll have, different parts of the system set up. In mammals, they've got to have the uterus set up. If there's no pregnancy, then, you cycle back around and, the whole system's ready to go again. So you can make those two cycles look far more similar than different. So it's really interesting.
Yeah.
But that brings us nicely to looking at what and where. Now, I tend to tackle these two things together because it's really hard to separate them, and I find it just much more useful to tackle what and where together. So if we go, we haven't spoken about asexual reproduction for a while, and if you consider for species that use asexual reproduction, what is needed? Well, they need a cell cycle to be able to create, the daughter cells. So whether that's the cell cycle called mitosis, or whether that's another cell cycle called binary fission. So the cell cycle has to be present, but they also need an appropriate environment. They need an environment that will support them. So they need an appropriate amount of nutrients, and all the environmental factors around them need to be appropriate to divide, basically. Then we move on to sexual reproduction, and you say what's needed. Now remember, I'm not just talking about humans here. We're talking about, and we're not just talking about mammals. All species, but I am focused a bit on animals here. But again, they need an appropriate environment. You need to know that you have appropriate nutrients, so food, water, shelter, safety. And safety is a really important one to think about. So in terms of nutrients, I spoke about in the previous section when we were talking about the when, one of the aspects I spoke about was seasonality, and that animals or species rather, that are away from the equator will tend to have a breeding season. So they will breed at a particular time of the year when nutrients and temperatures and the whole environment is best suited to support their reproduction. This is a really critical factor to think about in terms of endangered species. So if you think about loss of habitat, you think about loss of habitat means you've lost your home, you've lost your food source, you've lost your water source, you've lost wherever it is that you rest, whether you're a bird that roosts in a tree, whether you're a lizard that may rest under some bark of a tree or under some rocks, you have lost your habitat. There could be, so we could be talking about logging and land clearing. We could be talking about fire going through. So either way, your habitat is not safe. So if you manage to not be killed by that loss of habitat, then you will be moving out of your territory into the territory. You could be in the open, or you could just be in the territory of either a hunter who is going, another species that is going to hunt you, or you could be, if you're a magpie who's pushed out of your territory, you could end up in another magpie's territory, and they're not going to tolerate that. So, this loss of habitat is incredibly unsafe. And if you've lost your habitat, you're not going to say, "Oh, I think I'll breed right now." So loss of habitat has such an impact on safety that it actually impacts, you could lose an entire breeding cycle or a couple of breeding cycles. So it's a really important thing to think about. So appropriate environment is one big thing, and the second thing you need is reproductive biology, and that is very species dependent. So if we talked about it in the broadest sense, you need gametes. We've spoken about that. You need the sex cells, the eggs and the sperm. So you need them. You need fertilization. So how do you bring the gametes together to produce that new individual? Then you need, then there's embryo and fetal development, and then there's potentially care of young. So the question we can ask is, what anatomy is needed, or what parts are needed, what function and what parts are needed to support this. So in terms of gametes, you're looking at an organ that is going to produce those gametes, those eggs and those sperm, and that's the gonads, right? So that's the ovaries in a female, the testes in a male. So you also need a process, as I mentioned earlier. You need a process that is going to halve the genetics. So that process is meiosis, so that you end up with half the process. You need a process that is going to produce the gametes. So the big long word for that is gametogenesis, so genesis or production of the gametes. And you also need a production site, which is the gonads. In terms of fertilisation, this is where it gets really interesting, as you'd mentioned this before. So we have some species where fertilisation is external. So not all animals have internal fertilisation, and certainly some of them are frogs, some fish. It really depends on the species. But for species that have external fertilisation, where fertilisation happens outside the body, this is some invertebrates, some fish, and most of the amphibians, they've got their gonads where they're producing those gametes, then they need a way to get the gametes to the outside. So that's going to be some type of duct that is going to get them to the outside, maybe an organ to deposit them. So in some insects, the females have what is called an ovipositor. Then for animals that have internal fertilisation, so that includes some of the invertebrates, some fish, some amphibians, and it includes reptiles, birds and mammals. So you need a site for fertilisation in the female, because fertilisation always occurs in the female if it's internal. I don't know of any males. I should say it's possible that there is a male where I don't know of any where fertilisation happens in the male. So you need gamete transport to the fertilisation site. So you need a way to get the sperm into the female and then a site where fertilisation happens. And again, we're talking about ducts here, or channels that get things. Then we move on to embryo and fetal development. So there's many species where that happens externally. So some fish, most amphibians, most reptiles, birds and monotremes. So they're your egg-laying mammals. So they have a fertilised egg, and then they prepare that egg to be put out into the environment. So they need some type of, it's usually called a shell organ that puts a thicker shell around the egg, and then they need to be transported to the outside. And then they're pretty much done with the anatomy that they need. For animals that have internal embryo and fetal development, so these species include some of the fish, some reptiles, eutherian or placental mammals, which includes us, marsupials, and the monotremes. So you need a site for development. So in the female, that is the uterus. For some, this gets really complicated with the mammals. So for some mammals, so for the marsupials, which are mammals, they have a brief gestation in utero, and then they give birth to a very small, less developed, I'm not going to say underdeveloped because I think that's poor terminology, it's just it is born or released from the female body at an earlier stage, and then it moves into a pouch where generally it's a pouch. Some of them are, like kangaroos have a very well developed pouch, some of the other marsupials have a less developed pouch, but humans have for a long time considered marsupials to be lesser than us. And you could ask any female, do they want to give birth to a watermelon or to a jelly bean? And you're not going to have any woman say they want to give birth to a watermelon. And there's some recent really interesting research that suggests that the mode of reproduction in marsupials actually evolved later than the mode of reproduction that we use. So it is the later form, and any female you ask would say, oh yeah, that's what I would rather have. And then you need to be able to transport, there's all these ducts to transport things to the outside. In terms of mammals, you've got the birth canal or the cervix. And then we move on to that final section, which is the care of young. And the only animals that I know of that have some parts of their body to be able to support the care of young is mammals. And it is the defining feature of mammals. You know, we are the only group of animals, we actually produce a food to give to our young, which is just mind-blowing to me. So we've got the mammary glands, and of course the you know, most animals have nipples, but it depends on the animal, because you've got animals like, we need to remember that whales and dolphins are mammals, so they actually produce milk for their young, which is pretty amazing when you think that they're in the ocean. So they produce a very thick milk that it's just amazing, some of those differences. And also when you consider things like bats are mammals, so you can actually get photographs of I can actually, if I share my slide right now, because there's some pretty amazing photographs on this slide. So hopefully you can see this slide here. I've put humans up there. I've put one of our closest relatives, because I think the way these two mothers are looking at their young are just so similar. I just think it's remarkable. Here we can see an amazing photograph of a female whale releasing milk to her young calf. And so this calf is sucking as much of that milk up as possible. Must be taking in a fair bit of seawater as well. Elephants actually have their mammary glands up between, I didn't even know that until recently, up between their front legs. Of course, you know, these large litters where you've got, you know, you could have 8 or 10 young. Here is a flying fox with a young, not only holding on while the mum is in flight, but the bub is also feeding. He's actually suckling milk. And then, of course, the kangaroo with the young coming back. Like, there's pretty amazing photographs, aren't they? Just showing a breadth of diversity of species. So I think that, you know, we can sort of summarise that in this flowchart here. You know, you've got gamete production, and then you've either got external fertilisation or internal fertilisation. You can see the things that are needed for internal or external fertilisation. Then when you move down to embryo and fetal development, it's either externally or internally, and the things that are required. And then you move down to the care of young. And the only one that takes this route over here is the amazing monotremes, which of course are the egg-laying mammals. So they actually have initial development in utero, then they put out an egg. They have that egg will develop in a den, a kind of den, and then when they hatch, they are drinking milk from their mum. So it's pretty amazing systems. Yeah. Any questions? What do you think people out there might be asking, apart from marvelling at the amazing variability in reproduction?
Look, I think the marvelling is probably on point, because there, you know, we tend to sort of look at just one species, and but there's a lot of them, and they have differences, and I'm marvelling. I'm in absolute awe myself, and in fact, going back to why, you know, I started this podcast is very selfish. I love learning, and I love learning from people and experts in different fields. So you've said some stuff about species that I hadn't even thought of, hadn't considered. So I think the thing that sort of, at least that's in my mind, still is just those how unique those differences are between the different species, the ages of sexual maturity when that happens, the concepts of the village raising a young, and you can definitely see that it's not just something in us humans, although it seems in recent times we're kind of breaking that up and moving away from what was sort of more traditional, but you can still see it in animals in the wild, where you will have other females in a group that will help support the young. So,
and also it's important to understand that what I've got up on the slide here, this is my attempt to summarise animal reproduction. I haven't even touched on, because it's not my specialty, but you know, you've then got to think about reproduction in fungi. You've got to think about reproduction in the plants. You've got to think about reproduction in micro. I mean, I've tried to cover it a little bit and get people thinking about it a little bit, but it's nearly impossible to try and cover everything.
No, certainly not. Certainly not in an hour time that we have. And in fact, I think what you've spoken about today could probably have 2 or 3 sessions just on this alone. So
yeah, it takes us to the last, we're on to that last question. So that the last question is the how. And wow, like the how could be, I really did think, how am I possibly going to cover all of this? And the only way I can cover it in a presentation or discussion like this is really, the answer is briefly. We've got to look at the big picture, really. And I guess the big picture that we look at is, firstly, so I'm very much focused on sexual reproduction here. So there's the biology of sex, where we're looking at, you've got DNA, genes and chromosomes that are some of the underlying basic things that will drive the biology of the sexes. You've then got sex determination and sex differentiation. So I would, in trying to explain it to people who are not reproductive biologists, I tend to think of sex determination as being making the decision or making the plan, and then sex differentiation is carrying out the order. Yeah, so that's the way I think about those two. And then, of course, you've got the reproductive systems that then develop because of the DNA, the genes, the chromosomes, the sex determination and sex differentiation. And it's also really important to talk about here, excuse me, a lot of people think about, when we talk about males and females, if you ask people what that means, they will say, oh, well, females have 2 X chromosomes and male have an X and Y. Well, that's true in humans, it's true in almost all mammals, but it's not true in all animals. So, for example, the birds do not have an XY chromosome system. They have a ZW system, where the females have ZW chromosomes and the males have 2 Zs. So not only is it different chromosomes, but it is the opposite sex that has the same chromosomes.
Yeah.
And so when you come to things like assisted reproduction, like in mammals, you can look at the sperm and you can use particular methods to, I'm thinking of particularly a method called flow cytometry, where, you can separate based on the sort of weight and size of the chromosomes, and you can create 2 fractions of sperm where one has predominantly X chromosome bearing sperm and the other one has predominantly Y chromosome bearing sperm. Whereas you can't do that in birds, because in birds every sperm carries a Z chromosome. I'm seeing Mo going, oh yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? So the way that you have to do that in birds is you have to be able to sex the unfertilized egg and say this egg is carrying the Z chromosome, this is carrying the W chromosome. Amazing. Yeah, and then
it's the female that determines the sex of the female gamete. That's incredible.
But in, of course, in humans, historically, there's this idea that you need to bear male children, and of course the woman has almost nothing to do with it.
No, I find that, I say that to a lot of people, I feel so sorry for women in that, and historically as well, where the king or the lord or the big ruler of whatever that region is this woman is no good because she doesn't give me a son. It's like, well, mate, you're the one that's responsible. It's got nothing to do with her. I mean, she's giving you a healthy child to begin with. Like, how about thank you? That's a good start.
One of my favourite stories with that is, of course, the very famous Henry VIII and his 6 wives. I think many people don't realise that his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, he actually had for a substantial amount. I mean, he was married to Catherine of Aragon for 25 years, something like that. And the thing is, he was so worried about getting a male heir. In the end, his heir, his daughter Elizabeth, was the longest reigning monarch. So this idea you have to have a male, and yet she reigned for so long. But yeah, anyway. But so of course there's in some animal groups there's the XY chromosome system, so it's genetic sex determination. In some groups it's the ZW system. When we look at reptiles are amazing. Some of them have the XY system, some of them have the ZW system, but then there's also temperature sex determination. So you see that in the crocodiles, in the turtles and tortoises. You see that and I find that mind-blowing. And then some of them have a double system, which I've got to say that I find that so confusing, that you can actually have a sex chromosome system, and then over the top of that you can have an impact of a temperature-dependent sex determination. Whoa! So yeah, anyway, not going to go further into that, but they're some of the top-level things to keep in mind. And then once you've actually set up your system and you've got your males and your females, we've all heard that statement, what controls sex? And people go, it's your hormones. Well, sure. I mean, we all know that is one of the major control mechanisms. And there's this big, long word I'm going to talk about that even reproductive biologists hate to hear, but it's called the hypothalamic pituitary body axis. And although that's a very long thing, it can be explained reasonably simply. You have a whole lot of hormones in your body. The hormone systems are one of the major control systems within your body. They control a whole bunch of systems, not just the reproductive system. And there's basically 3 levels. So 2 parts of it are up in the brain. One is a part of the brain called the hypothalamus, and it releases what is called a releasing hormone. That releasing hormone acts on another part of the brain called the pituitary, and that releases a stimulating hormone, and then that stimulating hormone goes and acts on a specific part of the body. So if, for example, we were to talk about the thyroid system, the hypothalamus releases TRH, which is thyroid releasing hormone. It acts on the pituitary, causing it to release TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone, which then acts on the thyroid gland to release the thyroid hormones. So it is really that 3-tiered system. So if we look at the reproductive system, we've got the gonadotrophin, I know it's a long word, but gonadotrophin releasing hormones are released from the hypothalamus, acting on the pituitary to release the stimulating hormones, and there are 2 of those. So one is LH, which is luteinizing hormone. The other one is FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. And those hormones are present in both males and females. And then they act down on the gonads, on the ovaries and the testes, to then trigger a whole lot of other things. And then there's feedback systems that work. So that is your top level controlling system in the body for a whole lot of systems, including in the reproductive system. And it's worth here talking about how hormones are made. And I don't want to blow people's minds with the biosynthetic pathway, but I really want to give a shout out to a molecule that we hear a lot of bad comments about, and that is cholesterol. Now, in the body, acetate is converted to cholesterol, and cholesterol is the base molecule of hormones in your body. So although we hear a lot of bad things about cholesterol, we actually need it. If you don't have cholesterol, you don't make your hormones. So there is an amount of cholesterol that your body makes, and then you may take in cholesterol in your diet. So if you eat other animals, you will be eating the cholesterol that is within their bodies, within the meat, etc. that you're eating. So cholesterol is actually really important, despite the fact that it can be a negative, but it's really important. And then the other big system that controls, apart from the hormones, the other big system is cell signaling. And cell signaling is kind of a big sort of cover-all, but it's basically a complex communication within the bodies that coordinates and regulates cell function. And there's a whole lot of factors, whether it's hormones, growth hormones, neurotransmitters, and a whole lot of other things that act in this way. And I can share my screen again here with just sharing this picture here. All these little square boxes are representing cells. And so there's a number of different ways that cell signalling can happen. So these two here, both the green panel and the orange panel, indicate a way, this one here, the orange panel, is where a cell will release a factor that then acts back on that cell itself. In this one here, you have a cell releasing a factor that acts on one of its nearby neighbours. Then in these other two panels, the orange one here, you have a factor being produced within a cell that acts within that cell. Then you can have some that are transported directly to the neighbours through sort of connecting channels and ways. And then the final one is what we call endocrine, which is where a product which we call a hormone is produced by a cell. It's moved out into the bloodstream, and then it's transported around the body over long distances to act in other places. So they're the main ways that we know of with cell signalling, but we're always finding new things. So, if we talk about all those different types of factors, and the way I think, like, there's some of them where they're acting within the cell itself, I sort of think of that as, imagine you've written a post-it note to yourself, or you've written a diary entry to give yourself some direction. Then there are other ones where you're acting, where you've got cells acting on close by neighbours. I kind of think of that as, having a chat over the fence with one of your neighbours, or having a chat across the road with one of your neighbours. And then the endocrine system, that's where you're transporting across long distances. Think of mail, email, think of SMS messages, phone calls, or the internet. You're transporting messages over long distances. So I think everyone can relate to those kinds of messages, and that's kind of cell signalling that happens within your body. So, and that's not only the reproductive system that is controlled in that way. Every system in your body is controlled by that hormone system and that cell signalling system. And so we need to also think about, we have what we call healthy function, and I don't really like the terms normal and abnormal because we do get a lot of variability. But if you think about, there are ways where cells and tissues and organs and systems have been designed to function, and then there's when that function doesn't work properly and you move into pathology. So, the reproductive system is a system. It is supposed to work together in a coordinated way for the final outcome, which is producing, a new individual. And you need all of the components working together. And if it is all working together, then the individual is termed fertile, and they have fertility and they can produce a new individual. But if there's some kind of blockage of the system, or there's some kind of inappropriate or miscommunication within the system, then you end up with a pathology. It's not working properly. You'll have a lack of a component or something within a communication pathway, and you end up with lack of function, change of function. Sometimes it can just be change of function. You could end up with a disorder or a dysfunction, and that is when you end up in reproduction. You end up with a subfertility or infertility.
And I'd imagine those environmental factors can have
absolutely. And that's certainly where those, the things that you were talking to Professor Aitken about, it can happen internally, and it can be genetically influenced, but it can also be influenced by the environment around you, which could be the food you eat, the water you drink, the air you breathe, and the amount of even just the incidents and events that you are subjected to, so the amount of stress, and that's where it's affecting the safety of you as an individual. And there are various pollutants in the environment that have the ability to act like hormones. They're similar kind of shapes to hormones, and they're able to jump into the endocrine system and alter its function.
Yeah, I have some colleagues looking and working on the effect of one of those forever chemicals, PFAS, and which is that I think we could have a session in and of itself for that one.
Well, another one we could talk about, because PFAS, like, there's so many of them, but pesticides are a really interesting one, and I should declare here that I'm actually on the board of Pesticide Action Australia. So just as a declaration there, but pesticides also have the ability to act as endocrine disruptors, and PFAS is so associated with pesticides too. So, but that we've actually managed. I think it's taken us an hour and 15 minutes or something, but we've actually managed to cover all of these questions. And there's just a brief summary of those 6 W's. So I hope that's happy to. Any questions that, I don't know if that leaves you with any final questions, but that's a fairly quick overview of reproduction.
Yeah, look, it is a very complicated topic, and I think you've done amazing to summarise it in the time that you have, Nadine. The biggest question I have is, will I be able to have you back on again, so we can go into some of these in a bit more depth, and I think actually once we talk about things like planetary health, how that will actually impact on the six W's, right? So or 5 W's and a H. And,
the W is at the end of the word in
yeah. But yeah, look, Nadine, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been very, very enlightening for myself. I appreciate all the knowledge that you've shared, and I'm sure that people watching will have had the same benefit as well. And yeah, I will have more questions, and I will be discussing this with you offline. So yeah, for the moment, if people wanted to actually look into some of the work that you do, is there a way that they can find you? Is there a website? Or I know some people have Substacks or things like that, but
I on my very long list of things to do is to set up my website. But I'm certainly on LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn. I work at Monash University. I also work in my own company, which is called Enriched Pursuits, hence the EP in the top corner here. Enriched Pursuits, and it is on my list of things to do to set up my Enriched Pursuits website, so that and try and share some of these ideas there also on that website. So
okay, well, we'll hope our audience will keep an eye out for that. And yeah, in the meantime, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks very much, Mo.
Thanks, Nadine. See you.
Bye.